You guys get to put up with me again. So this is a bit of a different talk, though. So we've heard a lot about the news flows and metadata and things like that today, but one of the things we talked about is the amount of data we're moving when we move to the new higher resolution of Ultra HD. So what I'll be talking about for the next hour is basically going through what makes Ultra HD an immersive viewing experience. So it's not just about having more pixels, it's about having better pixels. So let's start a little bit here with some definitions. You might have heard through the media or going down to your local television store that you have 4K TVs, and then you also hear about ultra high definition or UHD TVs. They're the same thing. It's amazing how our industry loves to use multiple names to mean the same thing. It's not quite exactly the same thing, but I'll show you the difference here. So for 50 years, if pixel sizes and spacing on a display were all equal, which is not true, but let's just say they are, then for 50 years, plus 60 years, we had NTSC here, standard definition television. And then we had two forms about 15 years ago that came out for high definition. We had 1280 by 720, which is represented by the yellow region here. And then we had 1920 by 1080, which is represented by the light blue. Now it's important to note that that's HDTV, which is different than 2K digital cinema, which is slightly wider. It's 2048 by 1080, which is this here. And this is where it starts getting confusing. Because when you say 4K, what 4K? And in our industry, you might be working with both cinema and in television, and they have different formats. There's actually several different formats for cinema, but for when they call it 4K TV, they're really referring to what is known as UHD1, or UHD level 1, which is 3840 by 2160, or 4 times the spatial resolution of 1920 by 1080 HD. So it really should be called 2160p. How many people here call HD 2K? Nobody? I didn't think so. So that's where it gets a little bit confusing. So there's also something else in the industry that's being discussed right now colloquially as known as UHD1, phase 1, which is what we have now. And that basically is what we're doing with HD today, except it's progressive 50 or 60 frames per second, depending on the region of the world. So it actually has twice the temporal resolution of what's usually broadcast as 1080i HD. But otherwise, it's pretty much the same. So the dynamic range, the color space, the sample bit depth, looks like we're losing power, is the same as broadcast today. The one other thing I wanted to point out on here is this very large shape here. And you might hear that. That is known as UHD2, or in Japan they call it super high vision, and that is 16 times the resolution of HD. Japan has a plan in play. I believe they're the only country. Hugo's the only country really pushing it, right? Yeah. Japan has a plan that by 2020 they're going to be broadcasting in super high vision, or UHD2, which is here. But we're going to focus most of the talk today on UHD1. We're just going to call it Ultra HD, UHD. I might even call it 4K like everybody else. I just want to make sure everybody here before we start, if you don't understand this, the rest of this talk, you're going to get blown away, because this is how the industry uses these. So let's talk about the human visual system a little bit. We don't think about what we see and how we see, but try looking at something without looking directly at it. You can do it, particularly at night. If you remember those tests when you were back in elementary school and they had to try to see shapes at night, you could see better with the side of your eye. But in general, you don't realize it, but you're really only looking with the central 2 to 3% of your vision. The central field of vision, though, is about 90 to 100 degrees, and that's when objects are recognized. And of course, for those that have normal vision, you actually see stuff in your peripheral vision, such as motion, which is the fight or flight syndrome. You can't tell what it is necessarily, but your brain reacts to it. And that's your total field of vision. But mostly your high resolution images, just essential 2 or 3%. And this is going to become very important later when we talk about how we create images. But the central field of vision, which is what you oftentimes will watch TV with, is about 90 to 100 degrees. Hello. It decided not to work. Power glitch. Do you need to reset this? Oh yeah, Microsoft PowerPoint has stopped working. Do 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 do. Okay, back. He's redoing it. Yeah, can't handle the ultra high definitions. Too many bits. All right, excellent. That's all right. There we go. Here we go. All right. Are you doing that or am I doing that? Yep, good. It's working again. Excellent. Okay, so it's important to understand that the human eye can only resolve so much resolution. Anything that is a higher resolution than that, your eye just can't see it, okay? And it's roughly, for most people, somewhere around 1 arc minute. If you really want to get more technical about it, it's about half of an arc minute for many people, but it's about 1 arc minute. That's what you can resolve. So because of this, it does matter how far away from a screen you're viewing something based on its resolution, okay? So, without getting into cosines and tangents and looking at your eye, because your eye's visual system is in 3 degrees. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Peter. If you know the screen is 16 by 9, you can do some shortcuts and just use Pythagorean's theorem. And at the end of the day, based on the resolution and what your eye can resolve, knowing it's 16 by 9, that we have some good engineering rules of thumb, which we all love, right? We all love engineering rules of thumb. These are not exact, they're just rough. So if you go into the store and you say, I'm not to sit right here, the guy's going to look at you kind of funny anyway. But for the resolution of 1920 by 1080, which is everybody's HD in the panels today, the proper viewing distance is roughly around 3 picture heights back from the display. So if this is your display here, this white area, you measure that back. One distance for that is about right here. Then you measure out 2 more. So it basically is saying that somewhere around the 2nd or 3rd row is the last thing that you'll see if this was HD, the resolution of this. If you're further back, you can see the image, but you're not seeing all the resolution. Okay, it's very important to note that. With 4K UHD, because it's 4 times the resolution, again, the same space, so your eye can resolve more, right? You can see it, but you have to be sitting in a distance where you can see that resolution. So when you're doing the math, for the same size display, you have to be at half the distance. It's 1.5 picture heights away, and this is very key. Most people watch television in their home, set up in their room, where they feel comfortable for the screen size, what is known as the Lechner viewing distance, named after Bernie Lechner, may he rest in peace. Okay, Bernie had done some studies. RCA, they weren't official studies. He used to laugh about this, saying, oh, people thought it was some official thing that they did. He just went and called people up, how far is your TV set away? And they did that. And they found roughly it was about 9 feet or 2.7 meters in the average home as we watch TV. That hasn't really changed. And this is back in a time when we watched cathode ray tubes, standard definition television. So with that in mind, if you're not going to move where you're sitting and you have a higher resolution display, you have 2 choices. You're not going to see the higher resolution unless you were sitting too close to begin with, right? Or you're going to get a display that's twice as big, which of course any engineer is going to say you got to have a display that's twice as big, right? Yeah, like, look at all the heads going up and down. And that's the excuse I told my wife when I got the big, large panel. Hey, this is how it has to be. So this is why you see for Ultra HDs, you see panels that are upwards of 85 inches or even larger that are available now. Why? Because then you can leave your furniture where it is, and that's where the TV is. It's very important to point that out. If you have, and I have a chart on this actually, so let's just use this as an example here. So remember, 1.5 picture heights for UHD, 4K UHD, and 3 for HD. So at HD, basically, and this is 1920 by 1080, you fill up about 1/3 of your central field of vision. With UHD, you fill up about 2/3. I hope you can see that you're more immersed in this. Now, of course, if you're in the back of the room, doesn't matter how big I do this, you're not going to be immersed into it, right? But I hope you get the idea that if you're sitting at the proper viewing distance, 2/3 of your central field of vision will be taken up by UHD, which means you're more immersed in the display. Different type of immersion than if you're watching a sports game and someone in your family is trying to talk to you and you're completely ignoring them. That's a different type of immersion. I'm talking about visual immersion for it. You got a question?
Just so I'm clear, so it's assuming that the screen size is the same, but you've moved 50% closer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Or vice versa, you don't move and make the screen twice as big. Okay? So either one, you're more immersed in the display because that's the proper viewing distance. Now, what if you're not at the proper viewing distance? As I said, if you're too far back, UHD will look like HD or SD if you're in the back of the room, because that's what that looks like to you back there, okay? If you sit too close, what's the problem? You see the pixel structure of the television, so there really is that sweet spot. It's not at 3 heights or 1.5 picture heights. It's somewhere around there. It's a little bit fuzzy there. There's a couple of nice charts you can get off the internet. The source is on here. So this is really key, and a lot of places are doing this because they're basically picking on 4K Ultra HDs. So let's find the line here. How many people, I'm asking the geek audience here. How many people in this room have flat panels at their home that are larger than 50 inches? Larger than 50, don't include 50. Excellent. Larger than 60. Oh, we got some serious geeks here.
How about more projection?
You can include in projection on the same thing. Yeah, okay. Anybody have projection that's over 100 inches? I am. This is not the usual audience that you would present to. All right. So let's find something on the chart here, all right? This is a good one because it hits a line. At 6, and by the way, just as a little aside, I'm going to get my soapbox here. Why the heck do we measure TVs in diagonal? Never mind, okay. So, because obviously a 4x3 diagonal SD set doesn't give you the same size as a 16:9. But anyway, I digress. So it's at 60 inches, which is a decent sized television. 15 years ago, it would have been gigantor, right? Now it's considered just a decent size. At 60 inches, the proper viewing distance is 8 feet, okay? Which basically means you're getting the full resolution of 1080p, okay? Well, we're going to say 1920 by 1080 HD. If you sit any closer than that, then you start to see that Ultra HD is worth it. Here's the killer. You're sitting outside of that 8 feet, there's no point of having Ultra HD in your home. Yeah, go ahead, Carl. Mm-hmm. Well, it gets complicated by that, and I don't have time to do that here. It does impact it, but here's the problem. Your TV already is it's already converted the interlace to progressive. So the resolution's not really there per se, but your TV has taken a lot of the issues out that normally would be associated with us discussing the interlaced artifacts and stuff, because the TVs have the pretty decent electronics in them right now, and they can upconvert, and that's what they do. So you're not really seeing the interlace anymore. Just keep it. Notice that you don't really have the same resolution. If you don't mind, just for the purposes here, we can do it during lunch if you want. I'll talk to you about that. But for the purposes of here, if you're sitting more than 8 feet away from that Ultra HD set, and it's a 60-inch HD set, you might as well have stayed with your HD set. Okay, and really it's in this range where you get the full impact of it. Here's another way of looking at it. This chart is for projection televisions over here. Can you see the much bigger sizes? There's the same spot, 8 feet, 60. It's that full benefit of 1080p line. And then you can start to see where the full benefit of 2160, they're saying for 60 inches to get the full benefit of it, which you don't need to get the full benefit. If it's better, it's better. Did you see that distance? Can you see it on here? 4 feet. Now, I don't have any problem sitting 3 or 4 feet from the thing, put my feet up on the table, the coffee table, and have the coffee table be right next to the TV. I got a funny feeling my spouse would not feel the same way as I do. So hence the issue with this. Now, I'm not poo-pooing Ultra HD. I'm just saying that it's a great technology, but you need to get a bigger display than the one you have now, unless you're already sitting very close. Yes, Renard? Nope, not doing that yet. We're going to get to that. This is all based on UHD1 Phase 1 TVs that are out now. And all those TVs typically have to them are higher spatial resolution. Okay? This is why there's a lot of discussion of whether or not you'll see a lot of stuff in the media about why Ultra HD is not worth it, because they're basing it on solely on spatial resolution. So, we just talked about this. UHD1, twice horizontal, twice vertical, or 4 times the resolution of HD. Didn't seem that interesting, does it? Ha ha. But spatial resolution is not the entire story, and now we're not going to talk about it anymore because now we're getting into the real part of the talk. So we've already noted that when you're sitting with the UHD set at the proper viewing distance, it fills up 2/3 of your spatial, 2/3 of your central field of vision, right? As opposed to HD, which is 1/3, which means more of what's going on with your eye is being concentrated on the display. We all agree, right? That also means that any motion that occurs, particularly with complex sports, you could have a horse race, an auto race, maybe a basketball game, something like that. Any motion that goes horizontally across that screen, because you're more immersed into it, that angle that is traversing is wider, correct? So you're going to see more motion artifacts than you did before. They were already there. You just didn't see them. Why? Because you're sitting further back in relationship to the display. There are two major types of motion artifacts that we have. Some are intentional, by the way. So it doesn't mean it's bad, just saying they're artifact. One is motion blur. We're all common with that. Something whizzes right by you and it's blurred. You can't see it. Now, that could be done for artistic effect. You want to make something look like it's going really fast, you blur it. It makes it look like it fakes out your eye, because your eye can track motion. Your eye does track motion. Okay? If you're watching a sporty game or a match, do you want the people you're watching to be blurred? No. Completely take away from it. But if you're watching a motion picture, you might deliberately want it to be blurred. The second artifact, which some people aren't as quite familiar, this is easy to describe, you use this. This is hard to describe with a still image. It's known as motion judder. Okay, and the effect is like a strobe or a strobe effect. And what that means is your eye is tracking the image faster than the refresh rate. So if you only have 30 frames per second, we're talking about 1080i interlace, you only have 30 frames per second or something else. And the motion's moving faster than that. Or if it's film like a movie, and it's 24 frames per second and it's really sharply focused. The key is this trade-off. This is blurred, so it's not sharp. This is sharp. The trade-off is either you get blurry images or you get sharp images where it looks like they're stuttering. Have you ever watched something when you've seen stuttering across the screen? Okay. It's not often unless you sit close that you'll see it. But typically, like if you're at a sports pub or something and you're looking at an HD display that's really large and the basketball player is going by, you'll see the player stutter. The frame rate is not high enough because your eye is drawing that arc. Your human visual system draws pictures. We'll get into this a little bit later. Remember we talked about only looking at the central 2 to 3%, the fovea centralis. We'll talk about how your eye draws pictures, but you get motion judder. It is really annoying. This isn't so annoying. You're used to seeing that. This is really annoying. So what do you got to do about it? Because it's already there, but you're not sitting as close to display. So what do? You have a higher frame rate. Because a wider viewing area, you're more immersed, you need a higher frame rate. So it's not uncommon today that if you're going to have anything in Ultra HD and it's live video being shot, it must be at least 50 or 60 frames per second. So it's good that the interlaced at 30, which is equivalent to 60 fields per second, is not high enough resolution, which is equivalent to 30 frames per second. So it would be 60 frames per second. And they're actually vetting and talking about going to 100 from 50 hertz countries like Europe, or 120 here, okay? Now, for those that know what integer versus fractional frame rates are, I'm deliberately leaving these as integer because I don't want to complicate the matter. So if you know their fractional rates, I mean the fractional rates. If you don't know what fractional rates mean, I'm really sorry. I don't want to blow your mind with that. Just forget the word fractional. These are not the fractional rates you're looking for.
No, that's the SMPTE seminar Friday.
That is the SMPTE seminar on Friday that Bruce is giving, Bruce Devlin and company are giving. So what I mean by that, it's not really 60, it's really 60 over 1.001, which is 5994, yada, yada, yada. We're not going to get into it. Okay, but you understand the need for a higher frame rate because now when your eye is tracking it, there's more information and it's filling in by having, so the motion looks smoother. That's what you want for high motion sports. When you're watching something on a display and it's a sporting event or a music video or something live, you want it to look like you're looking through plate glass, like you're looking out a car window or a helicopter window. You don't want it to look like a movie, which is surreal. That's the difference. That's the reason why movies can be done at 24 frames per second. They shoot with a very narrow focus. Focal length is very narrow. Only the subject they want you to look at is in focus. Everything else is blurred, so they can get away with that at a lower rate. So let's talk about the most difficult thing, which is sports, okay? If you have a bunch of commentators sitting there talking, do you think you need high frame rate? Nope, don't need it at all. If you're focused on a huddle and it's not moving, you don't really need high frame rate there either. As a matter of fact, with most content, it's perfectly fine with just everything we have now. For regular sports in motion, 50 or 60 frames per second should be fine as well. When you start getting into speed play, someone's jumping over someone or throwing something fast, or a horse race, the horse's legs running in there, they don't want them to stutter, or auto race, you really do need sometimes even much higher than 100 or 120 frames per second. So why not go to 200 or 240 frames per second? Think of the data rate. Every time you double the frame rate in the uncompressed domain, you're doubling the data rate. This is already problematic now. With true 4K UHD in the uncompressed domain, it's 12 gigabits per second if you're carrying it over SDI. It's a lot of bits, and if you make it twice the frame rate, that's going to be 24 gigabits per second, okay? So that's where the limitation is. It has to do with just being practical and economical to deliver it. Otherwise, we do everything. So, all right, so now we're going to we talked about higher spatial resolution and the limitations of that. We just talked about higher frame rates and how it's really only applicable to a certain genre or type of material, not for every type of material, but when you need it, you want it. Now we're going to talk about color gamut. You probably don't know this because you're watching television, but if you watch and look at a bright sunny day on a TV and there's a picture of a rose or something simple like that, I'll have the next slide, and it'll look fine to you on TV, and then you go outside and you look at that rose. Now it's impossible to do this because of the bright sunlight, but if you could actually put that TV there and look at the rose, you'll notice that the color on your TV is not correct, not even close. This here is the visual surface colors that the human visual system could see done as an XY chromaticity graph. So just showing that it's in 2 dimensions, X and Y. There are 3 primary colors we use in television, red, green, and blue, right? RGB. So RGB. Once you put those 3 points, so wherever you put them, then all the thing you can do mathematically are straight lines between those points, right? Because you only have 3 points to draw between. In HD, this is a human visual colors, surface colors. In HD, all you see is this. That's known as ITUR, recommendation ITUR 709. 601 was SD. Ever heard of 601? SD was actually smaller. The triangle's actually inside here. What does that mean? Well, none of this green is being seen, right? It still looks green. It's just muted. It doesn't look quite right. The green grass doesn't pop to you as how rich and beautiful green is. That red rose I was just telling you about won't be quite as red, or something that's blue or deep blue won't be there. But look fine on TV because you're used to looking at TV, but it's not what it looks like in real life. With UHD, there's a new color space recommendation, BT 2020, which extends the points out here. So the red is lower, the blue is lower, and the green is much higher to give you much more realistic color now. Why can we do this now? We couldn't have done it 15 years ago. Calculation, processing speed and stuff. You just couldn't do that with technology, okay? It's still not everything the human eye can see, but it's much closer. By the way, for those that know, if you've heard of P3, which is the cinema, digital cinema space, that's about here, in between the two. UHD 1 phase 1 sets that you can buy do HD color space, 709 only. They do not have the extended color space. And by the way, none of them are over 60 frames per second either. Internally to the set, they might do frame emulation where they double it, but it's not the input side that does that. So this is one area where you can get much better representation of things for that, okay? Here's some examples of it here. So I promise you, there's a red rose, there's some violet colors and yellow flowers there. We have yellow daisies. I've been told the name of this butterfly 1,000 times. I can never remember it. No, it's not a swallowtail. I mean, it might be the type of swallow, but it's some butterfly in Australia. Anybody here know the name of it? That's it. What'd you say it was? Morphus. I can never remember the name Morphus. Anyways, it is a brilliant blue. It's actually iridescent to look at. It's absolutely gorgeous. I don't know if you can see on the chart here. To see that in its glory, you can't see it in HD. The color for that is outside the region, but it is within the UHD color space. This is a stained glass window in a church. I know that's tough to see back there. Almost all the colors that make that stained glass window, when you look at the bright sun through it and how beautiful that looks, you can't represent correctly on an HD TV. So this is a pretty exciting space, color gamut. But it only tells you the color. You still need more emphasis on this as well. So But before we move on to the next thing, which I think is even more exciting, here's a little quiz for you. This is an unusual size Rubik's Cube, right? I've highlighted 2 squares on there. Now, I know I got a bunch of engineers in the room, which means I got a bunch of skeptics. Stop trying to second guess what I'm doing and go with what your eyes are telling you, okay? Look at you guys are all laughing out there. Look at Bernard's big grin, he knows. Are these blocks the same color? Don't second guess it. What do you see? No, they're not the same color, are they? By what you see. What do you think now? They're the exact same color. You do not see color. Your brain creates color from the information it's given. So when you see 2 things that look so different to you when you look at them separately, this is no trick here. This is the same color rectangle drawn through it, okay? And when you see them in isolation, you can see they're the same color. Might not be the right color, but you can see the same color. Right color, because again, you make colors in your head. This is, your brain is not getting enough information because the color is in the shadow. So it changes it. It's important to understand how the human visual system works because we're using that when we do this more immersive viewing experience. That's one of several tests you're going to have. So if you saw 2 different colors, that is the right answer. If you try to tell me you saw the same color, you're being an engineer. What's that? You're not going to show us the blue and gold dress, are you? Actually, that was one of the slides in the original deck, and it has been removed. I got so much crap for using it, but that is what if you know what that dress is, the internet range. All right, we talked about more colors, right? We talked about higher resolution that your eye can resolve. We talked about a higher frame rate so the motion looks more natural. We're not done yet. This last area of discussion here, actually there's one more too, but we'll call this the last major area. It's called high dynamic range. It's probably one of the most misunderstood of all of them, okay? Because of the way it's been described. You have no idea what you're missing on your television because you have standard dynamic range. Now, by dynamic range here, just like you do with sound and other things, we're talking about the difference that you can see between the resolution in the dark images on the screen are black versus resolution you can see at the brightest light on this screen. Okay? This is one area where televisions have completely lagged behind. Why? It takes a lot of energy to make something bright, doesn't it? Energy star rating, that is. There you go. So, thing about high dynamic range is you could see a candlelight lit 10 football fields away at night. You see starlight when you don't have bleeding in from other objects. Very, very, very light colored. And yet you can see things and details in bright sunlight. Your eye is a pretty amazing tool for dynamic range. Your television, not so much. Cameras, by the way, are all capturing high dynamic range right now. Hugo, there's no cameras that don't do that anymore, right? They're all high dynamic range. It never gets to you. When it goes to the production plant and gets sent out, it gets smushed down to be the standard dynamic range of the production for your television, because why send any more? It takes more information and more stuff to do it, and you can't see it anyway with today's technology. So everything pretty much except the transmission area and the display, okay, is high dynamic range already, just not seeing it. Now let's talk about, remember I told you look with your fovea centralis, you only look at the 2 degrees. You try doing this. If I was measuring you looking at an object, okay, your eyes would be doing this. You'd be scattered all over the place. You do not look at a whole picture. Your eye is constantly drawing images. And that's what we're trying to show here. The human visual system reconstructs faces. Distance between the eyes, the nose bridge, the lips, the face. You're doing this so rapidly, and you've been doing this since you were born that you don't even know you're doing it. What do you see? What does your brain see? The whole image. That's not what your eyes are doing, okay? You build resolution through a complex mechanism. As I told you, only that central 2 to 3 degrees of your eye actually has very high resolution. Okay, very sharp there. And this action of drawing or eye track is known as saccadic motion. Okay, it's very important because as resolution gets bigger, you don't zoom into the pictures as much, right? If you have really high resolution, it would match what you're seeing if you're sitting in the stadium. You just show the whole stadium and leave it there. No camera movement at all. Let your eye follow the action. Look wherever you want to look, right? And that's the promise behind super high vision or UHD2 or 8K UHD, is you just leave it, no zooming. HD, when they first went from SD to HD production, as you know, they were messing people up. People were getting sick because they were doing too fast of zooms and moving around, because with standard definition, you used to zoom right in. Now you don't do it as much, okay? Big key thing, okay? You detect sharpness as a function of contrast. Remember, we just talked about high dynamic range. High dynamic range is having wider contrast. So I'll say it again. You detect sharpness, or sharpness is resolution. You detect sharpness as a function of contrast. Okay, let's look at these two pictures here. I'm not sure you can see this much further than about the third or fourth row. Which one of these pictures has higher resolution? The one on the right has higher resolution? Can you guys see that back? I don't know if you guys can see it back there. Can you see? So the one on the right is high resolution? Should have borrowed your buzzer. They have exactly the same resolution. The difference is the one on the right has higher dynamic range. The contrast is higher. This looks softer because you can't see the detail because it's low contrast. Deliberately made that way because this projector is obviously a standard dynamic range projector, so it's been deliberately altered to do this, okay? These are exactly identical, but the edges of the pixels look sharper to you or higher range because the contrast is higher. Very important. Okay. How does that translate to? With low dynamic range in a television today, if you have subtle contrast differences, this is what they look like. Look the same. Same thing, but with higher dynamic range, you can see the contrast differently. So in other words, there's more to see. Why am I telling you all this? Because you don't realize how unrealistic pictures on your television today look. And let's see if you can go for the best things you can get. Go get yourself a nice HD Blu-ray disc. Been professionally done, offline. We use the best we can in digital technology, so obviously there's some compromise. You can only put so much in a disc, but that only has a dynamic range that's set by a production standard that was defined in the 1930s. Hey, next test. Next test. Dynamic range in human visual system. Light gray, dark gray, right? All right, stop being an engineer, Peter. Does that light side look lighter than that side? Yes. How about now? See how the human visual system gets impacted by light that around it. They are the exact same color. Okay? It's just whatever is dominant to your eye. Okay? Okay, next one, because that has to do with dynamic range. All right. Is A or B lighter? The block. A or B? B's lighter. Can you see that in the back of the room? Bet you can't see the resolution back there, but you can certainly see that B looks lighter than A, right? That's showing you that your eye is sensitive to the distance doesn't matter as much. Okay, these are very important, and I could do these 100 times. People still don't get it. You're not seeing what you think you're seeing, okay? So the human visual system, let's talk about luminous intensity here for a few moments. Okay, we all remember learning science back in elementary school that your eye is made up of, this is oversimplistic, but eye is basically made up of rods and cones, right? Rods get activated in lower light conditions so you could see subtle resolution changes, right? Cones don't react in low light range very well, but when they get the proper amount of light so they can work, they see color, right? Forget all the fancy words that are on here. The point I'm trying to make is television today is right here, okay? Its dynamic range is 100 candelas per square meter. That's the reference light level. That's the peak light level on your television. This was defined, even though it's by BT 1886, which is for flat panel displays where it was codified, not too long ago. This is based on the response of a 1930s cathode ray tube. Everything that is produced for television today is produced knowing the viewing environment is 100 candelas per square meter. By the way, you get real tired of saying candelas per square meter, so we just call it a nit, N-I-T, same thing. The correct terminology, of course, is candelas per square meter, but nobody wants to say that. So that beautiful Blu-ray disc, with all the dynamic range of the original production, looked fantastic. By the time it got to that disc, it was cut down to be 100. And we'll show what that looks like in the next, we're going to emphasize that. Now, your human eye has more than a 10 to the 6 dynamic range, but it's in a variable dynamic window. You know that. When you go into a dark room after being in a light room, what do you see? Darkness, not much. What happens after a minute or two? Your eye starts to adjust to it and you see all the detail in the darkness. Then some smart ass opens the blind and the sun floods you in the room, and then you can't get blinded by that brightness for a second, and then your eye adjusts again, right? Your eye is a sliding window of that. But the dynamic range of your eye is hugely wider than TV. By the way, cinema's production for cinema is 55 nits. Why? That seems ridiculous. How can you have any dynamic range in a movie theater then if it's only 55 nits? Much darker. Why is it darker in the theater? Don't say because it's 55 nits. Think of how far, it's particularly in the older theaters, right? You have to throw light. That's a lot of energy in a bright bulb or new lasers now. So the way you make up for not having that peak bright level, right, is you make the room dark. That's right. Yeah, well, that too. You're absolutely correct. We're just not going to get into that one because it's not part of what I'm talking about. But yes, you are correct. So all these things come down to a very dark environment. Your home is not as a dark environment. CRTs could actually go higher than 100 nits, but that's just what they standardized on, okay? So, by the way, you can burn your eyes out, okay? Starlight's down here. That's the moon, light bulb, okay? You get the idea of what you can see. So, how many people here do still photography? Oh, good, most of you do. Have the newer cameras, newer digital cameras, you got a mode called high dynamic range. What's it do? Do you know what it's actually doing when it produces it? It's shooting multiple exposures, right? So again, just like I can't show a moving artifact like motion shutter with a still frame, right? And I can't show a wide color gamut on a display that's standard color gamut, but I emulated it. You're going to have to bear with me here too. This is a standard dynamic range projector. So in standard dynamic range is what exists now. You have to make a choice. You can do low light exposure, which means you're exposing everything that looks good in lower light. So you can see there's not much light on the bricks, right? In the foreground, the fountain here, in the buildings. But then what happens? All the stuff that's high gets crushed. It's just blurred white, no details, no nothing. You can't see anything in the details. The alternative to that is you do a standard dynamic range. You do a highlight exposure where everything that's bright gets exposed correctly, which in this case is you can even say, well, you can't see it back there because it's not super high vision, right? So it says Hyatt right here. And you can see this color, but then nothing else, you can't see any details elsewise. So the way you do it with the still cameras today is you actually take multiple exposures and you do something called tone mapping. In order to take the right density, this is what your eye, if you were standing outside, that's what you're really seeing with your eye. But this is all you can capture because of the light getting to the element in that. And that's the same thing with television. You have to make a choice between this. You can't show both. So they're very careful when they do films that they do the lighting correctly so that you see what you want them to see. And you've probably seen this during a game. You're watching a game or a stadium and it's half shaded, half sunlight, all right? Let's talk about either American football or soccer. You get the ball kicked, it goes up, it looks great, goes into the sunlight. Where'd the ball go? Don't see it because that camera, which is an automatic gain control, whoa, flushed out, and then it darkens right away, and then all of a sudden you can see the ball again. Of course, if it kicked in the goal or went in the net or whatever, you're not going to see that. So I'm simulating high dynamic range in the next few slides by tone mapping because this is not a high dynamic range projector. If this were a high dynamic range projector, it would look just like this image, except what? The areas of the light would be brighter, much brighter than it's showing here. It would stick out, just like it would if you were looking at this outside. You'd feel that brightness, and I do mean the right word, feel that brightness. So same thing on this slide here. This is an extract from a sequence that Dolby Laboratories did, and this is arc welding on here. Now again, this is not a high dynamic range projector, so we're going to simulate it. This is what it would look like normally, because we're going to clip it at 40%. It's completely blown out here. You can't see anything that's in the white okay? You can't even tell what he's wearing. The only reason you know he's brown gloves is because you can see him over there. But if I really should redo this and just show on screen. Can't tell it. You know he's arc welding because you're used to making up things with your eyes. But that doesn't really look real. This looks real, okay? With all the details on it. That's done through tone mapping and a couple of things to show you. Still have the details of the sleeves and the shadows here. Yet you can see that bright. If this were a high dynamic range monitor or television, this would be super bright. Like you'd see it as a point light, just like probably not what you'd see in real life because this is over 10,000 nits. This is probably 20, 30,000 nits, if not higher, right? Because if you're doing this, you have glasses on, right? But the point is, it'll look much more realistic to you if you were watching this on TV in a high dynamic range because it'd be so much brighter. But it's brighter as a specular light. See the word specular? Which means only this part is bright. Everything else is normal. And that's key. Dynamic range isn't about having a brighter display where you just crank the brightness up and then crank the contrast up on your TV. Okay? It's about giving the contrast where it belongs and only there. So it's just right at this region only. This will be bright. Everything else will be normal. Because if you make the whole screen brighter, what's going to happen? Fatigue. Just like when you if you don't like 3D TV, you rub your eyes after a few minutes, same thing, this will give you fatigue. So you want the average brightness of the set to be the same, you just want it to be super bright where it is. So why am I telling you all this? Because the electro-optical transfer function, EOTF, very fancy word. All that means is I'm taking electrical signals and putting it on the display. Opticals, what you see. We see in the signal domain, electrical signals are that way. This is what a TV set does. Okay, it's not linear. Neither is your human eye. What this means is, as this voltage goes up, the brightness is not linear. If it was linear, it would go like that, right? Very important. So it just happens to be by coincidence that the EOTF of a cathode ray tube very closely matches the EOTF of the human eye. I swear to God, it's just a coincidence they found this out. So luminous intensity, or the brightness of the screen, is equal to the voltage level, or whatever the signal, it's digital signal, right? You guys get that, to some power that you can see that's an exponential, right? That power is in terms of the Greek symbol gamma. That's where the term gamma curve comes from, okay? Happens to be for HDTV, that power is 235. And that's what matches the human visual system on that. The cameras have to do the reverse then, right? They're taking it from the optical world and converting it down. If they don't do the reverse function, when you go to get it back, you don't see it, okay? So they do an OETF, which is optical to electrical transfer function. Same thing, except now it looks like a log curve. It's the same exact thing, it's just in the opposite direction. So voltage, numerical samples, same difference, right? Here's something that's important done. This is actually done in the mid-1930s from Clark University. It was a measurement understanding contrast sensitivity to the human eye, okay? As it turns out, this is a log scale at the bottom here. That's 10 to the 0, so that's 1, that's 10, 100, 1,000, get it? You know what I'm saying? This is the sensitivity. The DL, the delta luminance, is a step size. What's the difference between one step and another when you can see? And from this, it is showing that as the light level goes down, the human eye gets much less sensitive to contrast. Or another way of saying it is, you could use a lot fewer levels in the digital domain, and you won't see the levels. When you go up high, your eye is much more sensitive to it, okay? Obviously, you only need to have this measured in between the red and the blue, where it actually matters for what the human visual system can see, and color grading should be done that way. As I mentioned before, I'm not going to get into the mathematics, I'm already behind schedule presenting this. Ambient light reflection makes a difference. If there's light reflecting off your TV, what do you see on your TV? Nothing, right? Makes it hard to see. How are you supposed to see high dynamic range if you're flooding the front of the TV with light? So you always have to have proper viewing conditions for it. So going back to this, the step size, this is the measurement of visibility is the step size, which is the delta luminance, over the absolute luminance. Okay, that's a measure of visibility. What can I see if I change the levels? This is known as the Barton's model of human sensitivity here. If the step size, in other words, in the digital signals, is below this curve, you won't see the transition between one step to another, which is good. You don't want to see the step size, right? Okay? When you map that signal to the display luminance in the TV, that's the gamma curve I was telling you about before. This is, oh, I should say one more thing I forgot to say earlier. All digital television systems today, when they get delivered to a consumer device, to a consumer display, in the home or whatever, they're all 8-bit values. All right? In other words, think about it. The real world is a ramp. You're walking up a ramp. That's infinite values as you're going up that ramp. You know you can't represent that with digital numbers. Everybody who's had beginning engineering knows that with digital values or anything. You're representing discrete values. You're quantizing, in other words, the steps. The more digital value depth you have, the more steps you have in a set space. You get tinier steps. You only have 8 bits. So 8 bits is 2 to the 8, which is 256, would be the maximum number of levels you can have. Okay? That's your step size. How does that translate into brightness here? Okay? You have the same brightness until you get to the end of a step. You then use the next value, you jump up a step. If that step is above this curve, the Barton's curve, which was measured, you will see that step. If it's below the curve, you won't. This is the human visual response, is this right here. Okay? So, obviously what this is telling you is that what we're doing today in television, you see steps. Okay? I'm going to show you a picture of this in a second. If you use 10 bits instead of 8 bits, which is what all production equipment is today, is done in 10 bits. To the home, 8 bits. Production equipment is 10 bits. You have 4 times as many levels, so the delta L is 1/4 the size. It slides the curve down. You don't see the visible steps anymore. That's why 10 bits are used in production, okay? Now, you can't see this back there, so I'm going to go to the next slide. Hopefully you can see that. Can you see that the left side of this has contouring, but the right side does not? Even in the back of the room? Excellent. Okay, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about visible banding. How many people think this is because the compression stinks and they've over-compressed it? You can see this all the time in night scenes when we watch television at night. Contouring and stuff. All these different layers of posterization or levels in the picture. How many people think that's related to compression? You're lying. Thank you for being honest. Everybody thinks it's related to the compression. It's what? Yeah. It's because it's only 8 bits. You're seeing the levels because it's above that curve. It's not because of bad compression. Wouldn't matter how many bits you put on it, you cannot do a sunset with its subtlety as it glows, those different hues with 250 different levels. You can't be done. You're seeing it. Remember, you're walking up the step, then you get to the next level, and then you have to jump to the next band. That's what you're seeing, banding, posterization. Okay, why am I going through all this? Why do we need 10 bits? Because we're talking about higher dynamic range, which is now a wider number of levels. We're talking about wider color gamut, which means we're talking about more colors. All those things take more of something. If you don't only have 8 bits to represent it, it's just going to exacerbate this already bad situation. Now, clearly, this is an 8-bit projector, so this is simulated, but that's what it would look like, okay? Be much smoother for that. You wouldn't see the levels for that. That's where the 10-bit sample cuts in. All compression standards, MPEG-2, MPEG-4 AVC, also known as H.264, all the way up until today, only did 8 bits to the home because that's where technology took it. It's finally in the new compression standard, HEVC, high efficiency video coding, with actually a main 10 profile where you can go to the home with 10 bits because technology has jumped forward. So, why am I even talking about this? So, that conversion factor for OETF, optical electrical transfer function, or electrical optical, doesn't matter which way you go here. We're using this example here. This matches the Barton's curve is the human sensitivity curve. You want something that closely matches that. That's the 8-bit gamma we have now. If we move it to 10 bits, it slides down here. But this is with standard dynamic range. If we now make it so that we're going much higher dynamic range, it's going to slide the curve this way. The average display for production environment is 100 nits. Remember we said that? The average LCD display that you can buy in the market today is around 400 nits, or 4 times the production standard. So it can look brighter on it. If it's an OLED, 800, 1,000 is where the OLEDs are now. And the new ones are coming out with the microcrystalline structure. They're over 1,000 nits right now, consumer TV. They'll be out by this Christmas season, right? Yeah, it'll be almost 1,500 nits out. We're getting there. It's still the wild, wild west because there's no standards. Okay, so we got to make sure we define standards in HDR so everybody will look the same. We talked about the film earlier, about splicing. It's the same idea. If everybody does high dynamic range differently, there won't be any standards. But the point is that if I move this up, 10-bit looks great here at 100 nits. At about 2800 nits, if I slid this forward, it would look just as bad as 8 bits at 10 bits. The curve doesn't work right for that. So we need other curves. So there's a couple of curves that are out there. There's SMPTE 2084, which is a perceptual quantizer curve, which is this green. And there's another curve that's been proposed by the BBC, which I guess they're calling it WHP 283. I don't know what that stands for, but sorry, guys. Which the reason why they're doing it their way is because when you slide, this is the curve here, the blue. When you slide it forward, they figured out that at about 2,500 nits, which is a pretty decent compromise and a high dynamic range versus going hugely up to like 10,000 nits or something like that, they can do the same curve for your standard dynamic range television as for your high dynamic range one, so it's backwards compatible. When the material gets really bright, that's when this curve comes into play, but your standard dynamic range TV can't display it anyway. There's a backwards compatible thing. That's the only thing in television we have today, at least in North America, that is backwards compatible. Only one thing. HD is not backwards compatible to SD. You put HD in an SD set, it will be black, right? It won't even show anything. What's the one thing we've done? What was that? Color. Color is truly done to be backwards compatible. It's it. There is nothing else that we do that's backwards compatible. So the BBC, even though this is a SMPTE standard, I'm representing SMPTE, we're SMPTE here, that was done for one area. They think they found something clever where they can do it without, that's a compromise though, because it's not, that doesn't match as good as SMPTE 2084 does. Yes? Oh, is that what it is? Thanks. So it's the BBC white paper number 283. Thanks. There you go. Fantastic. Thank you for that. Yes?
How does the, what I'll call standard loosely, 444, 422, 422,
How does the sampling matrix or the lattice? Yeah, everything in here I'm talking about here is 420. So you could do, well, 422 is very common for interlace content and for in production, but if you could do this in 444 as well, the reason it's the sampling lattice. It's basically the ratio of how much, for those that, I have to go back a little bit here. So in a television signal, not only is it digital, right, which means all the numbers that were analog are in digital, but there's actually 3 digital signals that are used. I know you think it would be RGB, but it's actually not. It's actually a luminance signal or a level of brightness, okay, which is Y, and there's a bunch of different color systems, but it's 2 color different systems, whether it's UV or CRCB or PRPB, there's different systems, but what basically saying is those color different systems, if you, your eye is not as sensitive to color as it is to brightness, so we found out to save compression bandwidth, we can actually throw away 3/4 of the color, again, to the home only. And if we compress it once, we throw away 3/4 of the color, it's better to use those bits to compress the brightness instead, and that's the 420 that's commonly done to the home. Everything is 420 to the home. If you're doing production, you want to keep the color in there, 422 or 444, depending on what you're doing, because if you're doing multiple generations of decode and encode and decode, you'll start to get chroma bleed and loss. So everything here I'm talking about is 420 because it's for the eventually for the home. Yeah.
high efficiency video codec the only codec ready to go right now for delivery that won't concatenate the 10-bit?
It's the only compression standard that is in an international standard that's available today that for the home or for the consumer devices that does 10 bits 420. There are other standards out there, but they're either for production, which means it's 422 or 444, which means the bit rate's too high for the home, or it's not an international standard. So yeah. All right. Everything's about compatibility with the production chain. We haven't even talked about that. So HDR and all these other features that we've talked about. Look at all the stuff we have in here. We have vision mixers. We have displays. We have something, storage disks. We had an earlier talk about storage disks. There's a lot of storage when you're going up to UHD. Something as simple as a cable, HDMI. HDMI can't do all these things and make it 4K, at least not the current version of it, even the new one that just came out. So there's implications across the entire chain. The other thing is, we don't really understand HDR that well. People say they do, but it's like I said before, it's the wild, wild west. So MPEG, which is part of that joint team that brought you HEVC, AVC, and MPEG-2 video before that, or if you know it as H265, 264, and 262. There's a call for evidence. The responses are due back in June or July, and they're looking to see, is there any changes we need to make to HEVC? Do we need new profiles to more efficiently encode HDR? When I say HDR, they actually mean what we call, colloquially, this is just a term I made up, HDR plus. And what I mean by that, it's HDR plus WCG, the wider color gamut, plus the 10-bit coding, could be 12-bit even. They're looking to see if there's a much better way to encode that. SMPTE is still looking at the end-to-end with the HDR. There's an HDR study group out now seeing what pieces of the ecosystem are missing. The ITUR is looking at something, because can't just call it high dynamic range. That's just way too easy, right? No, we get a bunch of engineers in a room. We got to call it something better. So it's going to be called EIDR TV. Isn't that better than HDR? Enhanced Image Dynamic Range Television. Because you can't call it IDR. Who knows what IDR is? Yeah. Oops, that acronym's taken. God, you get 4-letter acronyms that are already being used now they're fighting over. So it's the same thing. It's Enhanced Image Dynamic Range Television. They're looking at different ways of being able to cross the program interchange for that. All these different forums, the Consumer Electronic Association for displays, trying to standardize it. The Blu-ray Disc Association just came out saying the first generation of discs that are already being made for the fall holiday season are already out now, and they have a dynamic range proposal. HDMI Forum is this way of doing static metadata over it. All these different groups all over the place are trying to do this. And the display manufacturers right now, they're all doing it their own way. We're hoping to get this under control and do that. A moment on HDR. Maybe I'll skip this because I'm almost out of time. We're okay? All right, all right. Well, I still got more slides after this, though. All right. This interesting stuff? Okay. All right, all right. All right, so we've already talked about the BBC method as being 100% backwards compatible, and the advantage for that. Disadvantage is doesn't map as well to what the human visual system has as SMPTE 2084, the perceptual quantizer does. But there's, like all engineering, everything's a trade-off, right? There's no exact right or wrong answer. So you got to ask yourself a question. With HDR, are we trying to make a backwards compatibility signal, in other words, like the BBC did, like we did with color, or are we trying to make a signal that can be converted by some intermediate step? Maybe we have a set-top box or some type of electronics in front that'll take a signal that is HDR, convert it to something that can be seen by an SDR set without compromising that signal for an HDR set. That's another way. Or are we just going to do like we did with HD and SD and say, the heck with the whole thing, we're going to simulcast it. This jury's still out, okay? Yeah, yeah, that is one of the set of problems, that's correct. So all this stuff is happening right in here. We haven't even resolved all the patents issues on the compression standards yet, so. Historical note, everything is really important. When HD was first coming out 20 years ago, backwards compatibility was hugely important. We can't bring a new signal out and make all TVs go dark. What did we do? We came out with a new signal that not only made the TVs a completely different transmission system, it's digital versus analog, right? So, all right, the wider ecosystem. I don't have time to go through this in detail, but we get the camera sensor. We got the optical electrical transfer function mapped to the color space. What color space we're going to use, what interface standards. You got compression and content exchange here. Hey, 422, 444, look at that. You know, it's going to be 10 bits, 12 bits there. Professional decodes. What's the baseband interface we're going to use here? Is it some higher form of SDI? Is it some IP interface? Then we got graphics and production. If we do things in multiple layers, everybody goes, oh, we'll just dual layer everything. Every time you go through a production step, you got to put it all back together, do the production, and split it back into dual layers again. Think all the electronics have to be on the inside or outside when you have multiple layers. Then you have direct-to-home compression, full side or down converted. Which compression functions are being done? What conversion? Oh, there we go. In the compressed domain, we could have add insertion. Again, if you have multiple layers, if you're doing dual layers of scalable coding, you got to account for all that. Then you got the super decoder, we got a graphics overlay in the set-top, all the way back until we get to the EOTF. Piece of cake, right? All these things get impacted by any of the changes that I've been presenting to you today. It's not trivial. And we haven't even talked about the fact that how big the signal is. As I mentioned before, true 4K UHDTV, when I mean by true 4K, I mean that it's 3840 by 2160 spatial resolution. It's progressively scanned over, because all displays now are progressive scanned over. It's at least 60 frames per second, so it can handle a decent level of complex sports, right? Whether or not it has high dynamic range or the wider color space is immaterial for this thing, because it will fit in there anyways. That's 12 gigabits per second. You're not going to deliver 12 gigabits per second to your handheld over wireless. You might. If you're lucky enough and you live in one of the towns in the US that has Google Fiber, maybe you can get something close, but no. So you have to use compression. Hard to believe that MPEG-2 video, which changed entertainment television as we know it today, changed it. Completely digital transport, made everything that we're doing today possible. I'm just going to run down for a second here and grab my water. I've reached the end of my dynamic range. Okay, so MPEG-2 video standardized in 1994. Then we had MPEG-4 AVC, also known as H.264. By the way, MPEG-2 video is H.262 for those that are geeks. So for direct-to-home or direct-to-consumer, half the bit rate from here to here, 10 years later. Same thing, HEVC came out in 2013, about 10 years later. Half the bit rate again for direct-to-home or direct-to-consumer. Very important, because how the heck are we going to get Ultra HD if it's 12 gigabits per second? So how many people in here, I know there are several because I've talked to you, are broadcasters or service providers? I'll even let the cable guys speak up here. Okay? How many in here are using to broadcast in HD, over-the-air broadcast as MPEG-2 HD? How many people are using AVC HD and what they're doing? Probably not that many in this particular room. Okay. So MPEG-2 HD, when it first came out, you were lucky if you got a decent looking signal in 18 megabits per second. Now, if you push the edge and using StatMux, you can probably get down to about 10. That's kind of pushing a little bit. These ranges look about right. Then for AVC, if you were a satellite broadcaster or some of the other stuff, you'll use that. You have the bit rate again. See where this is going. With HEVC, it's going to have it again. So the same perceptual picture quality that is 10 to 18 megabits per second HD and MPEG-2, with its two standards later, 20 years later, is 2.5 to 4.5 megabits per second. It's HD. What are we going to do for 4K UHD, which is 2160p 60 10-bit? That's the minimum to be true 4K. Okay? Couldn't do it if it wanted to. Might be able to do it, but you can't do 10-bit to the home. Okay? Have to use this. If you project with the same type of picture quality you have today on either MPEG-2 HD or AVC HD, and you project that forward, you come up to roughly 8 to 15 megabits per second. That's great. That means Ultra HD can fit into the same bandwidth as today's MPEG-2 HD. Fantastic. What's wrong? This is totally legitimate numbers and run this in the lab. What's the most important thing about UHD versus anything else? Sound, that's correct. That's what we're talking about. That's great. Great answer, though. Great answer. Ultimate viewing experience. You want it to be immersive. Now, maybe this is a dirty little secret that not everybody knows here, but if you've seen really good-looking HD video, you know it looks fantastic. Shall we say that by the time it gets to your home, due to the trade-offs and economics of delivering signals, perhaps the signals don't look as pristine as they could for HD to the home or on the display. They don't. They're still better than any SD you ever would have, but they're not that good. So we're projecting for these bit rates, which would give you these, but if you're really going to go all out, the bit rate is going to be more like this. Because you get all the other things that make an immersive viewing experience. You need to get that higher dynamic range, and you get the contrast ratio up, get all the other things, it's going to be that. This is why you see so much confusion in the media when they talk about HEVC and Ultra HD bit rates. They're all over the map. A lot of times they're talking about 24 frame per second material too, which I will submit to you won't be as solid. Yes, Hugo.
Korea is 30,
Yep. Yep, Korea has picked 30. But again, they're picking it now with today's encoders. These are, I guess I should thank you, Hugo. These are mature encoder bit rates. So Korea has now selected 30 and 40 megabits per second, but that's using today's encoders. We know encoders get more efficient. Just like I said before, the same standard 20 years ago with technology need about 18 megabits per second. Now it's probably about 12. I know I said 10 here, but it's probably more like 12. Okay, yeah.
You're implying the 8 to 15 is 8-bit encoding and the 15 to 25?
No, I'm implying that if I go and extrapolate from today's existing codecs in HD and do the math and extrapolate that I know, because I'm a compression company, extrapolate where I would get to with HEVC using the HEVC model, still 2160p 6010-bit, I would get here, but I'm saying to you those pictures don't pop enough. You need a better picture quality than that, and that's where this comes into play. Does that make sense? And I want to make sure I'm not confusing people. Because if you do the math, you get to here, and I'm telling you, I've looked at those pictures. It doesn't pop. Yeah.
This then fits that model about is 4K really worth it, right?
So, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but for contribution, obviously this is higher bit rates here. A lot of people do contribution stuff on this. Costs, evil world of costs, versus consumer experience. So, part of my colloquial use of the English language here. But if you're doing a wide color gamut, it really doesn't impact your baseband network cost, your baseband storage. Not really known how much in the small screen. I think it really depends. And some of these small screens are really pretty bright. I mean, I got an AMOLED display there that really has a pretty strong dynamic range. But it's not really known yet. Large screen, absolutely. Most content will benefit from a wider color gamut, unless it's black and white, obviously. Legacy content enhancement. Can you take legacy content and can you enhance it? Yes, you can simulate that. High frame rate, incredibly expensive. You're doubling everything, doubling storage, you're doubling the system on that. Very, very expensive. It's very expensive baseband storage cost, HD. It's really expensive for UHD. But it has benefits all across. If it's sports material and your frame rate's not high enough, you're going to motion judder. End of story. So definitely benefits. But it is mostly genre-based. It's mostly limited to sports. There are other things too. You cannot make it up. People talk about making it up, and you can't make it up. Okay? You can kind of simulate it in the uncompressed domain by using motion compensation, but it won't have the sharpness. This motion will be smoother, but it won't be as sharp. High dynamic range. Cheap, yes, great.
What do you mean by cheap in baseband network costs?
For where? Which one?
For high dynamic range?
It means basically it's not going to take that much more to do the high dynamic range from the transmission side of it, or the storage side of it. It's very small comparison to frame rate. I am hearing that Hugo disagrees with me. Maybe I'll hear his presentation tomorrow. 4K resolution. Expensive. Unclear here. I think this is a little harsh. I think it's actually some benefit here. It's a disputing I have with one of my colleagues in the product group. Definitely here. So, and you can enhance some. We've seen some pretty decent up converters in today's TVs, the modern ones. They're actually pretty good. Taking an HD content and making it UHD, it's pretty good compared to where up converters were a few years ago. So this is just a crack of the chart. Everything here is opinions, as you said. And it's nice to know that in a room of experts here, Hugo only complained about this one block right here. Okay, so, yeah. Wow. You're like one of the modern news reporters that doesn't do news. You already presuppose the answer when you ask the question. Wow. Wow. I hope you're not interviewing people yet. I'm not proposing anything of the sort. Okay. UHD roadmap. Again, where we sit today is UHD1 Phase 1, which is 2160p 60. Okay. It's typically 709, which is HD color space. It really needs to be 10-bit. There's no discussion here. The standard allows it to be 8-bit because the displays are 8-bit. You really need to be 10-bit or you're going to get all that banding in anything, okay? Other couple of things aren't as much detail. Existing sound, nothing changed. What we're working on right now in most places is what we're calling UHD1 Phase 2. Commercial requirements aren't done yet in multiple standards bodies. It looks like it's gelling down a little bit. It doesn't look like we're going to be able to get for the 2017, 2018 timeframe. There's a lot of pushback against doing 2160p 100, 120 because they just don't think it's practical in the time frame. So here's a desire by the industry to do something to make a difference where we're just basically throwing a towel in and saying the complexity in order to do that actually requires a higher level in the HEVC standard. If you know HEVC, it will require level 5.2 to do this instead of 5.1. It's very complex. The chips don't think it's there. There's extra data paths they have to put in there. Again, it's on the consumer side. They just don't think they can make it economically viable in the 2017, 2018. This is hot off the press, by the way. The meeting was just last week. So it's not done yet, hasn't written off yet, but that looks like it's risky. So there might actually be a UHD1 Phase 3 that's in 2019, 2020. And that's really the shooting here for not many people, except for Japan, are really working on the standards. The Arrive group is with the Japanese companies, which is 4320p, and that's further out, but they're doing it. But really, it's a bit disappointing here, but you know, reality is reality. We're not getting everything we want, but this will have high dynamic range. We just don't know what format of it yet, and it will have the wider color gamut. The only thing they're having a hard time with is a higher frame rate because, again, it's so much data to work with in the data pass in the uncompressed domain. The compressed domain, not so much of a problem there. Phase 1 does not include almost any of the immersing technology. Remember, it's just 4 times the spatial resolution. We got all these other things. I haven't even talked about audio, by the way. I'm just talking about video, but there's some really cool stuff going on with audio right now. Okay, multi-channel audio, object placement, and things like that. Even if you only have stereo speakers, you get much better placement of that through sound field creation. But we have all these different areas that are coming in here. So still more work to do with that in the system. Peter, you had a question? Okay, so ATSC 3.0 is still in the decision-making phase right now where this will be. They'll probably follow with some of the decisions that the DVB had just made recently. It really comes down to all the same stuff. Obviously, I'm not in any official speaking capacity here for any other standards body, right? And like it's typical of most things, I don't want you talking about work in progress, but this is more general industry information on this. It's all about when the rubber hits the road, so to speak. You have to make these things practical. We had people that wanted P100, 120 in wide color gamut and HDR back in 2014, and we just said you can put anything you want in the standard, you're not going to get it in product, so why don't we make a standard that we can actually be interoperable to? So there really is a compromise between what you would like to have and what's just practical on that. Which brings up this wonderful piece of material here. This is, it's still out there. This is a little bit old, getting a little bit long in the tooth, but Jeff Morrison writes quite a bit for CNET, and this is why he says why Ultra HD TVs are still stupid, okay? He's freedom of speech. He is writing about Phase 1 TVs. I just want to point this out. And I hope you can tell from this presentation that doesn't really make a huge lot of difference unless you're going to do a lot of things. So it does for some people, but not for a lot of people. But I hope you can all see this new stuff, the wider color gamut, the higher dynamic range, the 10 bits. When the displays start doing that, which is only going to be the next few years, or the display manufacturers are starting getting smart now that it's not just about having more pixels, it's about having better pixels. There we go. Question in the back. Mm-hmm. Yeah, wasn't that in my first slide? Didn't I have that format in there? Oh, I think I had the other one on there. I guess didn't mention it. But yes, the film archiving is a different format. That is correct. Store 4x3. Yep. Yep. Totally different. Yep. That's right. Right.
So the reason I bring this up is if you're going to use historic film material, be aware that there's a different set of standards out there for film-related archiving that will need to be interoperated with to get that film material into 4K and 8K.
Very good. Thank you for that additional information, which implies even more why it shouldn't be called 4K, right? It's 4K TV, 4K film, and 4K cinema. So, summary slide, which is making Peter happy because he's not blowing the horn on me, but he's doing this spazzy thing with his hands. So, will 4K? Yeah, wrap it up. Will 4K or UHD1 services be successful? You guys tell me. I really think it comes down to if we want it to be, it will be. We have to stick to making it transformative, which means don't release crap. Basically, come out with the good stuff and make sure it's in there. And try not to have a repeat of in-between standards that nobody can do stuff for. Also keep in mind that everything you hear as 4K is not truly 4K, okay, when it comes to video. It doesn't mean it's not 4K on the range. You have to have 10 bits. You have to have 60 frames per second, okay, if it's going to be video. 24 frames per second is not going to cut it. 8 bits is not going to cut it, okay? High dynamic range may end up being the single most wow factor, which brings up a point. Where's my straight man back there? So why don't we do 1080p, HD, HDR, wide color gamut 10-bit. Has all the immersive stuff, just doesn't have the spatial resolution, but it saves you 2.5 times the bandwidth transmitting it. So it's something to think about. If you can't see it, unless you sit close enough to it, now it's not as popular in the US because we have bigger homes, so we can put bigger displays in. But I can tell you in Europe, enhanced HD is really getting a strong following. And it's because their viewing environment is smaller.
You have to set it up in ITU.
Well, it's not, it's ITU and SMPTE both, yes. So there's been a lot of people talking about let's get this done. So, and of course with that one, it would be, you might even do P120, which would definitely need a new standard interface. Doesn't exist yet. So there's I hope I'm telling you, there's still a lot of work to be done. If you're wondering why this is, hopefully a lot of it will get done. Phase 2, which would be really interesting in that. We have standardization of technologies. We have standardization of interfaces. I think Hugo's going to talk a little bit about some of those tomorrow. Standardization recommendation for workflow, for interoperability. We've just pretty much left most of that out. But I hope you found this tutorial interesting and of value, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to do a full-length keynote for this. Thanks.